Hello and a very good afternoon to everyone. It's an enchanting day indeed. Respected Dr. Alka Parekh ma'am, Director of Amity Institute of Liberal Arts, Dr. Siddharth Dhadwal, Faculty of Political Science, and all other dignitaries present over here. Today, we, the students of Amity Institute of Liberal Arts, along with a formidable force of volunteers, have been bestowed upon with the immense pleasure of welcoming our distinguished guest, Mr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia. Mr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia will be speaking on the topic The Inconspicuous Growth, an in-depth discussion on the staggering economic growth in the first 7 years of the UPA and the current economic crisis surrounding the Indian state. I, Nishant Kumar Jha, on behalf of all the students and the participants, welcome you to our webinar session, The Benevolent Republic. Welcome, sir. The
Thank
term
you.
state of the Indian economy has always stimulated deliberations amongst economists, academicians, politicians, and most importantly, the people of India. It has now become conventional wisdom to say that staggering economic growth is the linchpin towards fulfillment of all aspirations. In 1947, when India became independent, it was described as a regressive, dirt poor country with rampant malnutrition, a nation doomed to fail. By banking on sustainable economic progress, India has liberated a substantial amount of population from the clutches of poverty, thereby incrementally moving from a low income state to a middle income country. Riding on the waves of globalization along with an outward market oriented policies, India today has successfully established itself as an open market mixed economic democratic system which will act as a paragon for other emerging economies to emulate. From an emphasis on the Mahalabanist model of development to the implementation of distinct policy recommendations in the iconic M document, the trajectory of the Indian economy has been full of twists and curves. So, how did we get here? What were some of the policy choices which culminated into unprecedented levels of GDP growth? What were some of the trade offs which India made? What was the reason for staggering economic growth in the first 7 years of the UPA government? Is reforms by stealth the only viable way reforms can be carried out? With no end sight of the COVID 19 pandemic, what are the repercussions the Indian economy will have to go through? These questions will form the cornerstone of our session. And in order to comprehend and ruminate on this esoteric topic, we have with us one of India's finest economists, the formidable and the erudite, Mr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia. Montek sir does not require any introduction. His policy documents, his books, and the distinct portfolios he has held speaks for themselves. He has recently authored a book by the name Backstage, the story behind India's high growth years. The book not just talks about his personal journey, but through the book, he also precisely distills some of India's most contentious economic debates into a manuscript that will literally serve everyone, from government to industry and academia to even those who are disinterested in politics. On a personal note, the book provided me three unique perspectives. First, that the book is a very apt chronicle of the evolution of India's economic policy making. It reveals to us that while the 90s and 2000s certainly saw a break from the orthodox central planning that bottlenecked our economy, India's full embrace of the market remains hostage to the firm grips of our socialist ethos. Perhaps this is a reflection of who we are, or perhaps it is an Indian consensus. Second, the book truly gives meaning to the words that the past is the prologue. By gleaning insights from errors of the past, it provides a clear guide for future generation policymakers. The book is a constant reminder that the unintended consequences of populist policy making can and will implicate India's full potential as an economic power. And finally, it would be erroneous to believe that the book serves merely as a compilation of our economic history. By exploring distinct policies, the reader gets a clear sense of the author's opinion on the evolution of India's political climate. Indeed, this book is as political as it is economic. One of the most interesting anecdotes from the book are the political constraints which makes it unfeasible to initiate reforms. This is accentuated when a former prime minister, while resigning from the post, looks at Montek sir and says, Montek, I might have broken my leg, but I have definitely scored a goal. Who was that Prime Minister? Well, for that you'll have to read the book. Montek sir, we are indeed honored and immensely grateful that you have taken out time from your busy schedule to have a conversation with us students. Thank you so much for that. Now, without further ado, I'll request Montek sir to please step in and enlighten us. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Nishant, for that very comprehensive background description, and also for the very nice things you said about my book. I really love that. I mean, much more than nice things about me, because I think the book is really what I really have to convey. And I can't resist a little advertisement for those of you who haven't seen it. This is what it looks like. So I don't know whether the lockdown is opened up in Mumbai enough for you to go to bookstores, but go to the bookstores, buy it, and maybe order it from Amazon if you can't. Now, I've been asked to talk about the UPA years, the post-UPA NDA years, and the current situation. So I think, rather than simply going on and on about things that you may be less interested in, I had suggested to the authorities that I will talk about each of these briefly, posing some questions, and then wait for you to ask questions so that I address the things that you are actually most interested in. So first, let me talk about the UPA years. I personally feel that if you look at statistics, just plain statistics, there's no doubt whatsoever that during that first 7 years of the UPA, the average growth rate went to a level much higher than we had ever seen before. Now, there's some confusion because the GDP numbers were changed, etc. But I'm using the GDP numbers that existed at the time. And for the first 7 years of the UPA, we had an average growth rate of 8.3%. Okay, there's a big question which is relevant. I mean, was this just luck? Was this the result of a global boom? Was this the result of policies that were implemented earlier and not during the UPA? And to what extent does the UPA itself deserve any credit? Now, this is a very difficult question to answer. And those of you who are students should recognize that, it's always nice to ask questions. And all answers are self-motivated. But let me give you mine. Number one, there's no doubt that if you do any statistical analysis, this 7-year period stands out as a big break. I know that some people think that this period actually began in the year before the UPA. In other words, 2003, 2004, which is the last year of the Vajpayee government, because that year had a high growth rate of about 8% or so. But that was a high growth because the previous year was a depressed year. So you had a bad harvest, depressed year, and 83, 84 looked high. But if you make adjustment for that, I don't think that was a particularly high period. There's no doubt that the UPA growth rate was much better than the NDA growth rate during the Vajpayee period as a whole. So the 6-year period compared to the first 7-year period, no doubt about that. Many people say, well, all this is just the delayed benefits from the 1991 reforms. I think that's true, because the 1991 reforms were the big breakthrough, the big change from the old control-oriented socialist mindset. And I think we made a change, an important change, and it played out over time. One of the big important things that happened was that successive governments continued the reforms. So the United Front government, which succeeded the Narasimha Rao government, continued the reforms. And I think the Vajpayee government also continued the reforms. That gave people a lot of satisfaction that, the policies that had changed were not politically controversial. Although, of course, at any given time in a democracy, it's the job of the opposition to criticize the government. But when the opposition comes into power, if it does the same thing, while claiming whatever credit it can politically, it reassures businessmen and other people that the country is on a particular path. So I do think that the continuity of the reform from 91, 92 onwards was a very important part of the positive UPA story. But I think it's also important that the UPA, the personalities that were there, Dr. Manmohan Singh himself, Chidambaram as finance minister, these were all people who were known to be reformers. I think the doubts about the UPA arose because there was also a kind of the left-leaning part of the UPA. And after all, it was supported by left parties from the outside. And businessmen had a lot of suspicion of the UPA because the UPA fought the election criticizing the Vajpayee government for the India Shining slogan. Now, that was politically effective, that criticism. But I think the presence of reformers in the UPA government very quickly reassured businessmen that, obviously we are going to be bothered about inclusiveness, but this government knows that the name of the game is to support the private sector, put in more investment, etc., plus take care of inclusiveness. Now, this is a very important point. I don't believe that in a country like India, with so many poor people, you can have any successful policy that doesn't reach out to the poor. You simply cannot have a successful policy that says, my policy is that the government will not be responsible for anything, the market will do everything. I mean, that's just nonsense. The government has to provide infrastructure, the government has to create an environment in which some of the basic economic infrastructure functions well, ease of doing business, removing restrictions on foreign investment, persuading people that opening up is good for you. And I think that the UPA did a lot of that. And to my mind, that was behind the investment boom. But it's also true that that was a boom period for the global economy and we benefited. You would expect that if the global economy is booming, that India would do better than it did before. But the extent to which India did better was much more than can be accounted for by the global boom. So my story is that in the first 7 years, India had a macroeconomic environment which was supportive of growth. The fiscal deficit was brought down quite a bit. It released resources for the private sector to expand. And the fact that reforms had begun earlier and were continued created an environment where efficiency could increase and the economy did extremely well. It is true that in the last 3 years, growth slowed down. Now, there are many, many reasons why that happened, and I go into those in the book. One of them, quite frankly, is that, the internal contradictions of deregulation and liberalization began to present themselves as conflicts. Environmentalists in particular felt that a lot of the opening up to the private sector was essentially encouraging firms to go in and do things and ignore environmental considerations. Now, actually, even the public sector used to ignore environmental considerations. I mean, that's very clear. But when the private sector did that, it became much, much more controversial. So you had a lot of environmental restrictions on investment, ongoing projects being stopped, people going to the courts to stop projects, etc. And I think parallel with that was the growth of the allegations about corruption. Now, I spent a lot of time in the book on those corruption allegations. I think they were politically managed beautifully in the sense that the opposition was able to convince people that huge amounts of money were being siphoned off. Now, if you look at what happened, just take the 2G, for example, the numbers that were being thrown around were just huge. And most people thought that people were collecting bags of money equivalent to what was being talked about in the press and simply running away with it. Whereas in fact, what was happening was that resources were being handed out at a lower price than maybe could have been obtained had they been auctioned. Now that's very different from the image that is presented of massive scams. But I think the government simply failed to address that issue. I mean, politics is about raising controversial issues, and it's the job of the government to actually address them. My feeling is that the government at the time said that, look, the law must take its course. I mean, simply because somebody makes an allegation, you can't start taking corrective action, especially if you're in a coalition government. you have to say, all right, then you resign, which is what Raja did, and then the court takes over. Now, unfortunately, our court system is such that it takes a very, very long time. And actually, in Raja's case, as you know, I mean, he was actually acquitted. I mean, the court said, and he was not acquitted during the period of the UPA, he was acquitted subsequently. Simply said there isn't enough evidence. So it's a difficult issue, but I think the UPA didn't handle it well. And by the time the elections came, I think people were just fed up. You know, after all, if you had a government that's had 2 consecutive years, terms, it's not altogether surprising that the vote goes against you. And that's really what happened. Now, what about the next government? Along comes the NDA. And, you know, initially, I think the NDA clearly wanted to differentiate its ideas quite a bit. But some of the basic slogans that it put forward were not that different. I mean, it talked about, you know, Sabka Saath, Sabka Haath, Sabka Vikas, sort of everybody included, development for all. Talked about becoming globally competitive, which is a good thing. And various other, talking about becoming competitive internationally and inviting foreign investment to come into India. So in basic policies, there didn't seem to be much difference. But I think what happened was that, you know, in the last 3 years of the UPA, I mean, the growth had slowed down, and in the 3rd year, it had just begun to edge up. In the first couple of years of the NDA, that edging up continued. But then it got interrupted. I mean, I think the demonetization of 2016 was a big hit. Immediately after that, there was the GST. The GST, in my view, by the way, is a very good reform. I mean, we had been trying to get it done for the previous 6 or 7 years. But I think the way it was done was somewhat ham-handed. The structure of the GST became inefficient. And the technology platform on which it was operating was also not functioning as well. Smaller businessmen who had been badly hit by monetization were especially badly hit by the GST. So that was the second shock. And growth rate in the NDA government after 2016 have been slowly coming down. So actually, even if you remove the COVID effect and just go up to the growth rate, let's say up to the 3rd quarter of the year 2019-20, excluding the 1st quarter of the current year, the average growth rate will be less than the growth rate during the UPA. So it looked as if the economy was going to boom. The government talked about, you know, getting a $5 trillion economy by 2024, which would have required an average growth rate of 9% at the time. But the growth rate never got to that. And every year that it missed that, it meant for the remaining years having to go well above that. And that never happened. So I think the UPA growth performance in the first UPA government actually disappointed. Now you come to the current state of the economy, and the current state of the economy is a post-COVID state. Now I think it's very important politically not to make the mistake of blaming the government for what's happening because of COVID. Because this would have happened, I mean, we would have had a problem whoever was in charge. So my earlier comments are about how well the government did before COVID, and there I think, you know, it didn't, in my view, do all that well. But in the post-COVID situation, we need to take a hard look. Where does the economy actually stand? Now, you know, I think we have to remember that COVID is not just an economic crisis. It's actually basically a health crisis. It's a health crisis of exceptional dimensions, okay? And because there isn't a cure and because there isn't a vaccine, the only thing that any government could do was to slow the pace of the growth of the disease in the hope that in that period, either a cure or a vaccine will come up, or otherwise you'll be able to expand your health facilities to cope with the problem. I mean, if you don't expand your health facilities and the disease expands, then mortality will be high. If you're able to expand and the disease slows down, mortality will be a little lower. Around the world, I mean, I don't think COVID has been handled particularly well. I mean, the United States, Latin America, and Europe, infections have shot up everywhere. Some of them are now unlocking the economy, but then you're getting a second spike. We're doing the same thing. We're unlocking, and at the moment, other people have been unlocking at a point where the new cases that were being registered were coming down. We are unlocking at a time when the new cases are still going up. So it's a different kind of situation. And I mean, in our case, the unlocking has had two impacts. The first impact, the lockdown has had two impacts. First is a very significant cut in production. I mean, that's unavoidable because you're not allowed to produce if factories can't produce, etc. Then you're going to have a decline in output, and associated with that, you're going to have a decline in income. But in addition to that, what you've got is a situation where the hit is the most on the poorest section of the population. I mean, most of our factories, for example, 50% of the labor they employ is regular and 50% is casual. So when they get a hit on output, the first thing they do is get rid of casual labor. And of course, in the informal sector, there's just open unemployment. So it's been a big hit on output and a disproportionate hit on the poorer people. And you're seeing that in the migrant crisis, where poorer people in the cities losing their jobs, not knowing what to do, heading back home and being blocked from doing it. And you can argue whether that was well managed or not well managed. But the net effect in the current year, I don't think the government has actually given an official estimate yet. But over the past 2 months, independent estimates are being made, and they're all becoming more and more pessimistic. The most recent that I've seen suggests that we could have a decline in GDP in the current year, which could be in the range of 9 to 10%, although a more cautious estimates say we would have a decline of 5 to 7%. Now that's a very big, we've never had a decline of that kind in the past several decades, basically. So this is not going to be a good year. And that means that revenues will be low for the central government as well as for state governments. Revenues that will be low for the central government, they have the option to borrow more if they want to. State governments don't actually have the option to borrow more unless the central government allows them to borrow more. Now the central government has allowed them to borrow an extra 2% of GDP, which is good. But the shortfall they're experiencing in revenue is much more than 2% of GDP. So there's a real question that will the states not be able to make their expenditure targets? And I think this raises the real question that should we have a bolder fiscal stimulus? There's been a lot of confusion in the public mind on the size of the stimulus because it's been described as 10% of GDP. But that stimulus includes the injection of liquidity into the banking system. Now, merely injecting liquidity into the banking system isn't the same thing as a stimulus because the banks don't want to lend. You give them the money, they put it right back in the Reserve Bank of India in deposits of the banks. So there's an open question. Are we doing enough in terms of fiscal stimulus in order to meet the challenges before us? Now, the government hasn't actually declared what it's going to do. So it's still open to it. They've said they're going to borrow an extra 2%, but they haven't said they're going to stop at an extra 2%. So I just don't know what is the fiscal strategy. But my own view is that what has been done so far has a very limited fiscal stimulus. It's mainly a liquidity stimulus. It's not a fiscal stimulus. Most other countries have done more. And to my mind, I think we need to do more. Now, this needs to be looked at in the context of what it would do to India's fiscal deficit. Definitely, it will raise the fiscal deficit, and the fiscal deficit is already quite high. But in my view, we should not mind the increase in the fiscal deficit this year, but we should combine that with a very credible effort to reduce the fiscal deficit over time. You know, the reason why a high fiscal deficit is bad is A, that it crowds out other private investment. That's not a problem this year because the private sector is not investing. The second is that a high fiscal deficit raises the debt to GDP ratio and therefore makes our fiscal situation more unstable. But that problem can be addressed over the next 3 or 4 years by having, once the economy recovers, by having a much tighter fiscal policy and also doing the kinds of things that will cause GDP to grow more rapidly. Because, you know, you may have a high GDP ratio, but if GDP can expand rapidly, then this ratio will automatically come down, independent of what you do on the fiscal deficit. So this comes to the last point that I want to discuss, which is what is the prospect for India's growth post-COVID? Now, I said that in the current year, a fall of 5 to 7% of GDP is pretty likely. By the same token, I mean, it's quite likely that we'll see a recovery next year. In other words, in the year 2021, 2022, you may see a 7% growth. But that 7% growth is not what I would call an underlying growth. It's just a recovery going back to where the GDP was in the year 2019-20. So it's kind of a big dip and then an up again. The real question is, after we've got back to what we were in 2019-20, how will the economy move forward? That's very difficult to judge, but the IMF has said that most developing countries, their potential growth rate in the future is going to be at least 1 percentage point lower than was thought to be the case earlier after the recovery takes place. Now that means that if we thought the longer term growth prospect was about 7%, then actually we actually grew at 6%. But you know, even that 6% depends on being able to fix a lot of problems which have been building up over time and have been neglected. I mean, these problems, one of the most important of them is this health of the financial system. Both the banks and the non-bank finance companies. You know, there's no way that industry or services can actually sustain a healthy expansion if the banking system, including the non-bank finance companies, are not able to support it. And let me say that for the MSMEs, it's really the non-bank finance companies that provide credit. Banks don't give very much money to MSMEs. So a lot of the liquidity that's being pumped in more likely will go to the organized sector. MSMEs have to depend on the non-bank finance companies. Their financial position is also very stressed. And I think we need a combined strategy of reforms that will take care of the problems both of the Indian banking system and of the Indian non-bank finance companies. Plus, there are all kinds of pending issues of different sectors that need to be addressed very quickly. Finally, there is a big question mark on our policy today, and that's actually a result also of global uncertainty. Are we going to continue to be an open economy, encouraging competition from abroad, or are we going to build protective walls to protect domestic industry and keep out foreign competition? Now, there is, the slogan Atmanirbhar, self-reliance, has different meanings. As it was used by the Prime Minister, he also said that we must become a part of global supply chains. So, if you define self-reliance as becoming strong and a part of global supply chain, then you can't be resorting to protective tariffs, because if you start having protective tariffs, then you're not going to be part of a global supply chain. I'm not actually talking here about the policies we follow vis-a-vis China. I mean, China is a unique case. There are security problems with China, but I'm talking about general protection levels. What is our policy? And I think that the perception of most people is that we seem to be slowly slipping back into the mentality of the 1970s. That is, you resort to protection in order to help domestic industry? That's a big question. And I think it's a question that needs to be asked. Is that good or is it not good? When the reforms began, I mean, industry had all these doubts. I think the reforms showed that when Indian industry was made to face foreign protection, foreign competition, they were able to become efficient, not in every area, but in many areas. Okay? I think one of the areas we didn't become competitive was in some of the smaller scale because we never got rid of reservation for the small scale until much later. Had we done that much earlier, even the small scale sector would have become more competitive. So that's a big question. I think there's no doubt that the present policies rely on supporting private sector. There's probably not much doubt that the present policies want to attract foreign investment, excluding investment from China, which is in a different category. But there is doubt about whether we want to build protective walls to shield domestic producers from foreign competition. And I think we need clarity on that, and we need to work out a sensible policy. Well, you know, there are many other policy reforms that are needed, you know, land reform and land transaction, ease of doing business, labor laws, etc. Some things are happening, but if we can, in the next 2 or 3 years, unleash a way of action that will be seen by people to be both effective and just. It's very important, by the way, that it should be seen as just. Merely getting rid of labor laws is not the solution. What you need is an efficient set of labor laws, which we don't have. So if we can do that, then I think one can hope that India will recover the capability of being one of the faster growing countries. So let me stop at that point and let me invite questions.
Right. That was quite detailed, sir. You have mostly covered all the grounds that we wanted you to highlight on. So now let's quickly get into some of the questions. I will basically start with one key thing that was coming to my mind, especially when I was going through your book and also at the time when I was looking at some of your interviews. Now, how do you make sense of the NDA one's policy of Smart India, Make in India, and other Startup India kind of projects, which started off well with the initiation of the policy, but did not launch where it was supposed to go? Do you think that is true, or somewhere we have not analyzed it properly?
Well, you know, when you say smart startups, I mean, this is not a new policy. The idea that we were going to have more venture capital, the idea that we were going to rely on technology, the idea that we were going to build technology frameworks, that derives from the UPA. I mean, after all, most of this stuff rests on the Aadhaar. And Aadhaar was actually started by the UPA and pretty much completed by them, with Nandan Nilekani being brought in order to make the thing possible. So I think what the NDA government did was it used a different set of names, but it essentially tried to take the same idea further forward. You know, I mean, I think startups have not done as badly as people think, because I think over these several years, there have been many more startups in India. And some people tell me that the number is quite large. But I don't have really good data on how many of these are successful, how many of these are expanding, how many of these are becoming unicorns and that kind of thing. But you know, I think government can only play a facilitating role. To my mind, the biggest thing we need to do is to have much more digital infrastructure. And we don't actually have as much digital infrastructure as we need. You know, the speed of internet access in most parts of the country is far too low. And certainly outside the cities, it's quite low. So while lots and lots of people now have smartphones, I don't think we've created the digital infrastructure that allows them to transact seamlessly in transferring huge amounts of data. So that's a very, very big item on the agenda of the government. And of course, it's not just the government, because we're not expecting this to happen only through the government. I mean, the private sector plays a very major role in it. But you know, what stops that very often is problems of right of way. I mean, if one of our large telecom companies wants to lay fiber optic, it needs all kinds of permission to lay the fiber optic. And I think, and that some of it is central government problems, some are state government problems. I don't think we don't have an atmosphere in which the entire system is working in a problem-solving way to take care of these difficulties. We need to do more on that front. I think it's also true on startups that our tax policies are not actually very sensible. You know, I'm not talking about sort of giving tax relief. I mean, for example, there are endless problems that if you have a small company and you bring in some money, if you get questioned that is this really your own money or is this truly an independent investor? Are you recycling money? That becomes a kind of a money laundering allegation, which sends you in a totally different spin. So I think we are putting investors in a framework in which they would have to deal with a large number of very, very difficult questions. Let me give you another example. We know that the GDP is going to be negative, maybe 5% to 7% at least. Yet I saw in some newspapers that the Department of Revenue has reiterated to all its tax people the targets that were set at the start of the year, when the GDP was supposed to be growing at 6 or 7% in real terms, and maybe 10% in nominal terms. Now, if GDP is not going to grow at that rate, then these targets simply cannot be achieved. But as a practical matter, if every tax officer is told that your targets are not changed, you're going to get assessments which are unreasonable. I mean, they will disallow expenses, they will exaggerate profits, this, that, and the other. And they will then say, look, you can appeal this, but this is what I'm going to do. So I think this is an example where a failure to recognize that there's a problem. And that problem is not created by the government. I mean, COVID wasn't created by the government. But failing to recognize it leads to second order problems, which are created by the governmental system. So I think, you know, if you're a very big company and you have a large mass of people who know how to handle these things, and you have lots of money, and you're there for the long run, you can deal with this. But if you're a startup, a new company, any of these things hits you, I mean, you can get clobbered. And I don't think we have a sufficiently supportive tax administration that will encourage young companies and see them grow.
Okay. So another thing, there's been quite a buzz about smart cities ever since NDA-1 came into power.
Mm-hmm.
Government has taken significant measures to, work around these the long-term plan that they have. What are, according to you, the plausible measures that are required at the level in which India is currently to have something called as smart cities in coming 10 years or say 15 years or so?
Well, you know, in my family, it's my wife who's the expert on urban stuff. So I'm kind of counting on what she's been telling me and has been working on.
Right.
And I think most people who study the urban systems will say this. You cannot think of a smart city as take the existing system and lay a little bit of fiber optic and have a little bit of Wi-Fi. I mean, that's like saying, let us multiply the number of cyber cafes in each city by a certain amount. That's not a smart city. I think in order to have a smart city, you have to empower the city. You have to have a city government that responds to the city electorate. And you have to have enough financial resources going to the city that will enable them to do a good job. Now, if you construct any indicator, the degree of empowerment of cities in India is very low compared to the empowerment of cities elsewhere. And there's a tendency in the part of state governments to think that the cities don't have capacity. Now, that's true, but you know, if you don't have money, you're not going to build capacity. The country has capacity. If money went down to the cities, yes, there would be a little bit of a transitioning period, but sooner or later, the experts would go to where the money is, and they would start advising. And the city government, if it is responsive and accountable to the electorate would try to produce a better city. I think we can never have a smart city if we do nothing, and we have done nothing. We talked about it, by the way, in UPA, but we did nothing. And the fundamental reason we did nothing is that in our constitution, the empowerment of the cities is not something that the central government can do. The empowerment of the cities is something that the state government has to do. All the constitutional amendments are there, but they require the state government to devolve. And no state government wants to devolve, irrespective of political party. So I'm very suspicious of whether we can do very much in terms of smart cities unless we can change this fundamental relationship between responsible city government, accountability, and devolution of resources. I mean, look, cities, in simple things like user charges, paying for water, all these things are not being done by cities, they're being done by state governments. And until we can get to a better balance on that, I don't think we're going to get smart cities.
Right, sir. Nishant, can you put forth your questions that you had?
Yeah, thank you very much, Montek sir. It was very enlightening to listen to you.
How come you're not on the screen?
Yeah.
Camera is not working, unfortunately.
Unfortunately,
Well, so you can rule out Mumbai as a smart city in that case.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Sir, my first question to you is that, whenever one reads an opinion editorial by any Indian economist, one word which almost all economists are tempted to use is the word reform. Time and again, you have mentioned that, reforms, there are different kinds of reforms which exist. Like there is something called as a big bang reform. Then there is something called as a gradualist reform. There's something called as opportunistic reform. And then there is something called as reform by stealth. Can you elaborate a bit on this?
Yeah, I think that's very good. And I do make a point about that in the book. See, the definition of Big Bang reform, rather the term Big Bang reform, became very popular around about 1989, when the East European countries were shedding communism. And they tended to sort of say, well, look, just get rid of communism, open up everything to the market. And actually what happened was a few oligarchs managed to get all the goodies. So I think the notion of rapidly doing reforms is not a good idea. I'm very much in favor of what I would call gradual reforms, that is, you move step by step. And my definition of gradual reforms is that you build a consensus that, look, this is the way we want to go. And in a way, in UPA, a little bit of that was done. I mean, for example, Dr. Montek Singh said that we're going to reduce customs duties, which were very, very high. And we're going to reduce them to the level prevailing other developing countries. Now that kind of gave a benchmark so people could judge that India's average customs duty was 70%, developing country average at that time was probably around 15%. So we're going to go down from 70 to 15. Ideally, I would have said that we should say we're going to do that in 5 years or 6 years, whatever you like, so that everybody knew that this was going to be done year by year. That's what I call gradualism. Okay. Now, another approach is what I would call, what I have called opportunism. That is, you point in the broad direction and you say you're going to do it, but you don't actually do it to a set pattern. You kind of wait to see when it's politically feasible, and then you quickly do it. So that's what I call opportunistic reform. It doesn't give the policy, it doesn't give economic decision makers a clear signal on what to expect, except it indicates that's the direction, but God knows how long it's going to take. Now, the third is what is called reform by stealth. There, you're not even actually saying what you're going to do, but you just sneak it in whenever you can. And I think that is the worst, because reforms very rarely are what I would call a pure win-win, in which everybody wins. Usually, a reform hurts some people and benefits other people. In time, those who are hurt kind of benefit from the fact that the growth accelerates, but some of them may not. Sometimes a person is in industry which is dying, but a new industry is being created. So the same person who's kind of losing his job, they find his son is getting an even better job, or his daughter is getting an even better job in a new industry. Let's say an old style worker in textiles has a son and a daughter who are computer engineers. So as the system becomes rationalized and there's some loss of jobs in the traditional textile industry, the son and the daughter get high paid jobs in the software sector. So there, I mean, maybe the family is actually managing to benefit, but not every individual in the same way. So I think you have to recognize that reforms are going to involve some people feeling hurt. One of the big problems with this is that, you know, the people who are going to benefit don't even know that they're going to benefit, because new jobs are going to be created and you don't really know what those jobs are. But the jobs you're going to lose are quite well known. And those who are in those jobs obviously get very insecure. So I think the idea of reform by stealth, that we somehow or the other will get it done, is not, in my view, very credible. We need to create a narrative, and a narrative that says that, look, this is how we've got to change. This is how there will be more efficiency. This is how large numbers of people will benefit. Yes, some people will be hurt, but then we want to do something for them so that we protect them. That would be an ideal reform program, but it's not very easy to do. Because, you know, when you start doing it, I mean, people start agitating, pointing to whoever is hurt. And if new jobs are going to be created next year, until they are created, nobody's benefiting from them. So it's very easy to create insecurities.
Right. Sir, if I can ask you one more question, and I would like to quote you from the book. In the book, you have mentioned, and you say, that the first 7 years of the UPA government was outstanding. And
Yep.
then you actually mentioned that during this entire period, we had an average rate of growth of about 8.4%, and we were able to uplift around 138 million people. So when one looks at this figure, one comes to a logical conclusion that you're talking about inclusive growth. The UPA government was able to successfully do that. But just 3 years down the line, the entire economy completely took a downswing. What are some of the fundamental reasons you think that we were not able to sustain such high levels of growth?
Well, let me say, when you say took a downswing, considering what you are now about to go through, I mean, the downswing simply brought it down to about 6%. So, you know, it wasn't a crash. But when you're riding on a heady 8+% growth, you raise the bar and you expect anything less than that to be unacceptable. You know, I was the deputy chairman of the Planning Commission when the 12th plan was approved, I think in the year 2012. And at that time, the pressure was that, look, we've already done 8+%, you should go to 9%, and businessmen were saying you should go to 10%. We knew that 10% wouldn't be feasible, but we did in fact say let's go to 9% as a target. But it became very clear in the course of the year that that was not going to happen. So by the time the plan was approved, I had lowered the target from 9% to 8%. And I was severely criticized by some chief ministers, saying that, look, this is pusillanimous. By a bigger effort, we can do something. But, you know, by then, the Eurozone crisis had exploded. And it was very difficult to think that the global economy was going to recover fast enough. So my view is that I think two things happened which slowed us down. One was that the global economy slowed down. And that was, I mean, if you're running a system that is more integrated with the global economy, that will have a negative effect. But I think what also happened was that some of the domestic policy issues were not well managed. There was overinvestment in infrastructure. Companies ran into difficulties. And suddenly there was a huge amount of environmental opposition to many infrastructure projects. And I think, you know, in our system, we should have had a more problem-solving approach to take care of these problems. I don't think we did. I mean, our approach was that, look, every ministry uses its own screen, And it's the job of the investor to pass through those screens. Although we could see that what was happening was that suspicion of the private sector had shot up, partly because of all the corruption allegations. And you know, when suspicion of the private sector shoots up, I mean, we have a system in which, in those days, the Anti-Corruption Prevention of Corruption Act, I mean, it specifically said that if some action of yours benefits some private party without a public benefit associated with it, even if you haven't taken any money, you're corrupt. Now, you know, if you're an individual and you're seeing in the newspapers all sorts of allegations that these fellows are doing this, that fellow is doing this, etc., and you have to pass a permission, and there are NGOs saying, no, no, this should not be allowed, these fellows are violating this condition, the other condition, etc. I mean, you would just be, you'd play it safe and you'd just deny them the permission or raise questions. I think our system was not clear enough. And let me say that very often the private sector kind of benefited from lack of clarity, because lack of clarity also enabled them to, you know, push the envelope a little bit somewhere on the ground that something isn't very clear. I'm not blaming just the government. But I think we can't do that. If you're going to have people investing huge amounts of money, getting other investors to put money in, then the method by which various kinds of environmental clearances are given must be very much clearer. And I would also say, by the way, that, you know, if you've given a clearance, you shouldn't be backing off it later on, unless, of course, that the clearance was given on the basis of facts which proved to be wrong. But very often what would happen is the clearance would be given and somebody would object, saying that this hasn't been taken account of, that hasn't been taken account of. Clearance would be held back and the whole thing would be re-examined. Now, you know, I don't think that a modern economy can run on that basis. So we need to think harder. And this isn't just a UPA issue. This is going to happen in every case. Because basically, if officials are going to be held responsible, it's costless for an official not to act. I mean, he incurs no cost from not acting. I mean, for example, if by action you are seen to have benefited a private investor with no clear benefit to the public, you're held responsible. But if you are seen to have benefited someone, but not doing it causes a big loss to the economy, you're not held responsible for that. So failure to complete the last 10 miles of a highway includes a huge loss to the economy because the investment that has been done is unproductive. But if you simply say no, I don't think you're held responsible for anything. We need much clearer laws to be in place so that government decision making and the system of giving permissions is much more predictable and transparent. And I think we haven't done enough work on that, quite frankly.
Right, sir. So now we'll open up for the audience question. Shubham, can you quickly read the questions from the audience end?
Yes, sir. Yes, the first question is from Gaurav, sir. He's asking in his book, The Third Pillar, Dr. Raghuram Rajan says that with extreme right-wing political ideology, economic growth tumbles down. How do you correlate this philosophy with the present government, their ideology, and the economy?
So what does Raghuram say? I didn't
He
get
says
that.
He says that with extreme right-wing political ideology, the economic growth tumbles down. How do you correlate this philosophy with the present government, their ideology, and the economy?
No, but what in the ideology causes growth to slow down? I didn't get that.
Extreme right-wing ideology causes the downfall of the economy is what I think he's referring to.
Yes, sir.
Well, yeah, I have a feeling what Raghu really means is that, I mean, any extreme shift, whether it's to the left or to the right, will disrupt disrupt some sections of the society, and will create a lack of consensus. I mean, this is where if you more or less continue down the same path, you still have problems, but you don't disrupt too many things. So if you have an extreme shift to the right, my guess is the same. Raghu would also say the same thing if you had an extreme shift to the left. Basically, you upset a large number of people, and in a modern economy, a strong sense of consensus and cohesiveness is very important for growth to take place. I mean, ultimately, investment is an act of trust, and investors have to believe that the system is holding together, the system is generating trust, people trust the government, because only if people trust the government will the system be able to behave properly and function efficiently. If they don't trust the government, then the effectiveness of the government goes down, and that's not a good idea.
Yes. Shubham, the next question.
The next question is from Kaustubh Das. He is a student of BA Political Science. He's asking, sir, during the 2020 Delhi election, various policies which were highlighted by the state government were, in his view, socialist in nature, but there are different perspectives regarding its viability and results. What are your views on such policies by the Delhi government?
When you say Delhi government, you mean Delhi state or the central government?
The state government.
The state government he's talking about.
I haven't followed the state government's policies closely enough. Let me say that I think part of the problems in Delhi is that the state government has, at least they say, and I think that's true, it's not a proper state, and that too many of the things that normally a state would be able to do are made subject to approval by the lieutenant governor, who is an appointee of the central government. So 90% of the disputes that go on in Delhi really relate to the state government feeling that it has not got the flexibility it needs to do whatever needs to be done. I'm not sure which specific policies you think are socialist, which the Delhi government has been following. But if the idea, I think, for example, the effort to strengthen public health, the effort to strengthen public schools, I don't think you should call them socialist. They are really what I would call the underpinning of any socially just, market-oriented economic system. Now, how well the government has done that is another matter, and that needs to be looked at very carefully. Remember that Delhi is also a very rich part of the country. So you need to judge, for example, you need to have a clear metric of whether the Delhi government is doing a good job, given that it's dealing with a much richer population or not. Some of the policies that have been talked about, like, a certain amount of free water, a certain amount of free electricity, I wouldn't necessarily call that socialist. It's just like creating a base level of access, which is either very cheap or even free. As long as it's transparent and it's not continuously being increased, the system can manage it.
Right. Shubham, next.
Right. The next question is from Alka ma'am. She's asking, how do we have to plan the Indian economy to live without Chinese investments and products?
You'll have to repeat yourself. So you
plan to live without Chinese. Look, I don't know what the government's position is on China. My understanding is that Chinese investment needs to be specifically approved. I do not know whether the intention is to disapprove investment in every sector, or whether the focus is on sensitive sectors. If our this is a real big issue around the world, that with cyber security making you vulnerable, most countries are now very concerned that you shouldn't give a country that you have problems with access to your cyber network. So if that's what the concern is, I don't know enough about it, but I think we need to have a clearly articulated policy. As far as investment is concerned, that's the issue. As far as products are concerned, I'm not aware that there is a specific ban on Chinese products, although I keep hearing that we shouldn't buy Chinese products. It's more like a sort of trying to encourage people I don't know whether the focus there is to buy Indian or just buy non-Chinese. So in other words, we're not saying you don't import, but we're saying don't import from China. So it's not very clear. So quite honestly, I think we need clarity. Now, you're not going to get clarity at a point when the border is being disputed. So quite frankly, right now, because we have an ongoing dispute with China, which isn't yet resolved, judging what our policies are economically vis-a-vis China is not going to be easy. Unless the government wants to make a clear statement, that this is our policy. And I don't think they've done that, actually.
Yeah, Shubham.
Right. The next question is from Rakshit. He's asking, what can the government do to amplify the Indian manufacturing sector?
Well, I think that's been known for a long time. I mean, we need much better infrastructure than we've got, and that requires more investment by the government, and also an encouragement of public-private partnership to build that infrastructure. That's one. Second, you need better labor laws, because internationally our labor laws are found to be too inflexible. You need better tax administration, because both domestically and internationally, investors and producers feel that our tax system allows far too much discretion and is non-transparent. You need ease of doing business in many areas, which has to be greatly improved. And I think you need probably a much better focus on skill development. Now, we found that during the UPA period, that in the early years, skill development wasn't a big problem. But once the economy started growing at 8%, we ran into severe skill shortages. Now, at the moment, since we're going to have negative growth, there won't be any skill shortages. Even if we start growing at maybe 6%, there may not be skill shortages. But I think if we have to aim better than that, the skill problem is going to become very important. Plus, I think technology is changing. I mean, not be able to systems of upgrading skills, etc. So those are the sets of things that we need to do. And I mean, finally, you need a much better financial system. I think one of the issues that comes in for startups is that if you're relying on startups getting money from abroad, then there needs to be great clarity about what is the tax treatment of these inflows and which inflows are going to be regarded as dubious. Now, let's put it this way. If I set up a company and somebody invests in my company, and you think that this person who's invested in my company is dubious and you start pursuing him, I don't care. But if you start assuming that I am responsible because he invested in my company, you start investigating me, then it's a huge problem. So I think we have to make life a lot easier for people who are starting companies and trying to get investment in them.
Right. Shubham, any more
Yes,
questions?
one more question from Rakshit. He's asking, Montek sir, do you think the depreciation of the Indian rupee vis-a-vis the dollar is a sign of concern?
No, I think in modern economics, the depreciation, it's a sign of concern in the sense that sometimes the depreciation can be driven by market-induced panic. And when that happens, you should try to offset that by following the right kind of policies and giving some clarity. Sometimes the depreciation simply reflects the fact that the objective circumstances have changed, and a depreciated rupee will actually help you to increase competitiveness. In the second case, you shouldn't fight that. Let me say that, a strong rupee, which is a sign of a strong economy, is a good thing. In other words, productivity is going up, the economy is becoming stronger, the rupee becomes stronger because India can export much more than it otherwise needs to. because of his competitiveness. But if the economy is weak, and that's being reflected in a weaker rupee, and you try to fight that by creating a stronger rupee, you'll only weaken the economy. So I think you need to be very clear that a strong rupee is not, it can be a sign of strength when it reflects a strong economy. A weak rupee is also a sign of good policy if the economy has weakened, because it's better for the economy if it has weakened to have a weak rupee than to have a strong rupee.
Right. Shubham, I think one more question and then we'll have to end. Shubham?
Sir, I think Shubham has got disconnected.
Yeah.
I would like to ask something if I can.
Yes.
Uh,
Yes.
Yeah, sir, as we are moving towards the end of the session, I want to focus on one man, which is the former Prime Minister, Manmohan Singh. I think in some sense, your book is incomplete is incomplete if we do not mention Manmohan Singh. I think at the end of the day, the image which remains in everyone's mind of the last 10 years of the UPA government is that of Mr. Manmohan Singh. There was a lot which he did, which was highly credible. But at the time he demitted office, people remembered him as weak, vacillating, and sadly clinging to the office at the cost of dignity. I know this is not a fair assessment, but why do you think Mr. Manmohan Singh was so reticent?
Well, I think you've asked a number of questions that you posed. They're all good questions. I think that when you assess the person in office, it's important to assess the person through good and bad. So the best way of assessing Manmohan Singh is what did he produce during his 10 years in office? And probably he produced an average growth rate of 7.6%, produced a big reduction in the number of people in poverty, produced a nuclear deal, which was a major breakthrough. I mean, a lot of what is going on now in terms of defense cooperation with the West would not have happened if the nuclear deal had not been struck and many of the obstacles, the shackles that were placed on us had not been removed. So yes, the last 3 years were not so good, but even there, by the way, the average growth rate in those last 3 years was not that bad, and it was turning up. I think what the second question is this notion of why did he cling to office? You have to remember, Manmohan Singh was not a prime minister of a majority government. He was not even the leader of the party which had the largest role in the government. And I think therefore politically, he was subject to many more constraints than that would be normal in a prime minister. Now, you might say that if you have all these constraints, then just don't be prime minister. But then, the 10-year record sounds pretty good. So, I mean, to my mind, if we had had somebody else, you have to ask yourself whether if you had someone else, that person would have been able to get all these things done. I don't think so. Clinging to office, I mean, when you're in that political situation, you've been put there, the idea of just dumping the government in the last 2 years, I don't think necessarily is a very brave act. So I'm not sure. I know that I've said that in the book, that many people felt that he should have resigned. But it's not as if the difficulties that were being faced, it's not as if there was a clear set of things that could be done and the system wasn't allowing him to do it. I think things had become very complex. And let me say that, when you're running a coalition government and heading to the last couple of years, the system also stops responding very fast. The bureaucracy also slows down. So I think he made it plain that, look, he's not going to be there after the election's over. But he stayed behind to do the best he could. I'm not sure that if he had been replaced, we would have had a better outcome. I'm not sure, for example, who would have been an acceptable substitute at that time. But of course, this is a decision that has to be taken by the political process. And I wasn't a part of the political process, so I don't know. I really don't know, in the sense that This is not a government decision, the political decision.
Sir, I'll like to end with one final question from my end. There is, looking at your book, also going through it in a greater detail. Now that you're off the stage from being backstage of Helm of Affairs, what is the recipe of having a more robust and resilient finance ministry? Do you think a majoritarian government forders better to a robust finance ministry than a coalition government?
I don't think the issue is majoritarian versus coalition. Uh, I think we have to recognize that modern economy is a very complex thing. And in order to run a modern economy, there should be very wide lateral inputs of expertise. It cannot be run just by politicians and by career bureaucrats. So I think that during the UPA, Dr. Singh, both in the 1991 reforms and in the UPA, brought in a lot of other people of significant standing who could bring some expertise into the system. And I think we need to do more of that. I mean, many of the things we are now facing, especially in the post-COVID world, there are new challenges. I mean, there are no rule books. And I think to appreciate what these new challenges are, we need to go to experts. We need to look at what other countries are doing. And in all countries in the world, new expertise is being brought into government. And we need to do that. I don't think that it's simply a question of having a strong government. Governments have to know what to be strong about. And the truth is, in a modern economy, there are differences of view,
Right. Sir, yes, Shubham.
So can we just have one last question?
Yes, please, Shubham.
Yes. The next question is from Deepak Havaldar, sir. He's asking, sir, the US tariff war against China basically started because China's manipulation of yuan rate against the US dollar. Was there any other problem? Was there any other solution to deal with this problem?
You mean between the US and China?
Yes, sir.
Honestly, I don't know enough. And I think the US administration has been so mercurial that you never know what's driving them. Certainly in the US, decision-making is very largely concentrated in the hands of their president. And you should read the book that has just come out by John Bolton, who was actually one of President Trump's key people, to get a sense of how decisions are made. I don't know enough about it. So I would not say that I know what drove the US and China tensions. Many people think it's whimsical decision making. Many people think that expert opinion within the US is not being consulted. Now, whether that's true or not, I don't know, but that's what people are saying.
Right, sir. Sir, with this, we'd like to wrap up the session, and I would like to invite Alka ma'am. Can you join us for summing up the session? Alka ma'am, Shubham,
Yes.
Can you? Yes.
I'm unmuting myself.
Yes.
And I'll just start the video.
Right.
Okay, so Mr. Ahluwalia, this was a very interesting session. And if I may sum up, then the major takeaways that I got from this as an economist was that when the reform started, you said that reform processes often make some people benefit and some people lose out. And maybe that's what then, as you said, 2004 onwards, the entire growth process was very inclusive. So now I'm able to see this very clearly as to how what we could not achieve in 1990s, we tried to achieve as a nation. Let's forget about this government and that government. But as a nation, yes, we tried to achieve these things as we entered the 2000s. And then the other thing which came out very clearly from what you talked about was also this entire reform process being inclusive. So how the major stakeholders should be taken together, and then because of that, when you are defining policies like, say, smart cities and things like that, how this entire philosophy of having everybody together not coming into picture would and actually result into the nation not really going towards that goal that it had defined for itself. So all of these were very interesting things to know. And the another thing which I also felt that was very necessary for us as the professors of economics to understand was also that uh, the world economy entered boom in 2004, and Indian economy also was growing very fast in 2004. But you said it very clearly that we grew much faster than just the boom would have caused. And so that entire putting together of the process of development of India was something which I think was very useful for us to know. And thank you very much. And we would advise all our students who have not yet read your book to read your book to understand all these insights that you are giving us into the economy, into the working of the systems which lead to certain decisions and things like that. So thank you very much for coming, sir, and this has been very, very useful for us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed it. It's nice interacting with people and getting an opportunity to answer questions which arise out of my book. I do hope that if you read the book, you'll find more answers than I've been able to give.
Yeah.
And I think hopefully you will. Thank you.
Right. On behalf of Amity Institute of Liberal Arts, I, Dr. Kumar Siddharth Dadwal, would like to thank you all. I would like to firstly thank Ahluwalia sir for taking out time from his busy schedule and joining us for this enlightening session, for sharing some greater insight over Indian economy, how we have transformed over the years and how we can recover ourselves from this situation of crisis. Some very important measures that he has focused on in this conversation. And I hope that the students of economics, politics, and law, and different other fields who have joined us today for the session will always benefit from this conversation. And we look forward to having him someday in our university as well, to more greater and more stimulating discussions on several other aspects of Indian economy and world politics as well. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thanks a
Thank
lot.